hmTv matters.
Hello, and thank you for joining me today. I'm your host, Rebecca Sparacio. This podcast is a production of the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center of Nassau County. On today's episode of Inheriting Memory on hmTv, my special guest, Alex Teplish, will join me for a conversation about third-generation Holocaust survivors. So let's jump right into the conversation. But first, Alex, welcome to hmTv. Can you tell me a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me. Alex Teplish. I grew up in Brooklyn, New York. My family and I originally immigrated from the Soviet Union, Odessa, Ukraine, to be specific. We came in the late 70s. We came here with my grandparents, my great-grandmother, my parents, and eventually my parents had my brother in America, and we've lived in America ever since.
Okay, well, we'll jump right into your childhood and what it was like growing up in a 3G household. So what was it like growing up the child of a second-generation Holocaust survivor? Since you're third generation, what was it like growing up with parents who had parents that survived the Holocaust?
I never really thought about it as growing up, that I was 3G or my parents or my father was 2G. But it was an interesting experience. To me, I thought everyone Jewish had a Holocaust survivor relative, or especially anyone who came from the Soviet Union had a Holocaust survivor relative. I actually grew up in a building in Brooklyn where we had a family member on every single floor. My grandparents, I had two sets of grandparents. They lived on two different floors. Then my grandfather's brother, who was also a survivor, lived on another floor, and we had family members on every floor. So anywhere I went throughout the building, I was interacting with my family and hearing their experiences, both growing up and living in the Soviet Union, but also during the war and the Holocaust, especially from my own grandparents.
Wow, that must have been great being around so much family. So how did your parents' upbringing under their survivor parents shape their own parenting? Like, was there anxiety, humor, gratitude? Like, what was your household atmosphere like?
Yeah, I definitely think that people who go through a lot of adversity use humor to cope. And that's why you see a lot of humor in the Jewish community throughout history. So both my father, my grandfather, and my grandmother, there's been a lot of humor throughout our conversations, throughout our lives. I think that also because my grandparents lost their parents and went through such tragedy, and they didn't finish school necessarily. They had to and abruptly stop going to school early in life, that they missed out on certain lessons in life that you would say in a normal life people would have, and may have not carried that on to my parents. Mm-hmm. So they had to adapt. They adapted. And I think they did well with it. But I think dealing with such tragedy helped them take a step back from the everyday problems and be able to cope with small everyday problems that people, or obstacles even, that people usually deal with, knowing that there's so much more out there that my grandparents dealt with and their parents. So it makes it, I can't say easier, but a little bit different to be able to understand life and the obstacles we deal with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And do you feel that can you pinpoint any of the lessons like that you feel like they didn't learn particularly, or they didn't pass on to your parents?
Yeah, I mean, my grandparents, especially my grandfather, who my book is about, we'll talk about today, he lost his parents when he was still a young teen. Mm-hmm. So he didn't necessarily have someone raising him from that point on, teaching him life lessons, giving him parental guidance. But despite all that, he remained a family man, very dedicated to the family, hardworking, didn't have a high education, but found ways to support his family and help the next generation thrive.
Mm-hmm. And did your parents openly discuss the Holocaust, or your family members?
Yeah, I know it's not as common. Many Holocaust survivors, either suppress those memories, hold back about talking about it. They're just too devastated to discuss it. But my grandparents were the opposite. They would, I mean, almost every conversation we have, the topic would come up. And as tragic as their experiences were, I felt like it was very important that they would bring those up and share with me. So throughout my life, I understood what the Holocaust was, what they dealt with specifically. I learned a lot more history related later. But my grandparents, almost every family dinner, it would come up as a topic. And it helped me also deal with life.
And when it did come up, would they tell like segments of the story, or did they tell like fully what happened to them? Like, did you feel that you had to piece together all of these different moments that they spoke about, or did they ever sit down with you and tell you like a full testimony?
Yeah, they never really sat down and said, all right, I want to tell you about my whole story. It was more like segments coming up in conversation. Oh, when I was in the camp or in the ghetto, we had this, or I saw this, this and that. So that's really how it was. It was segments. But later in life, my grandfather, in 1996, I believe, he gave an interview to the Shoah Foundation, and that was about 3 hours long. He spoke Russian, but I understand Russian, and I was able to hear his story end to end. And that's really the first time where I heard every single detail of his testimony. Yeah.
So I guess I want to get into the relationship that you have with your grandparents. Can you describe what it was like having them around? Were you close with them? Was there a distance between you guys? What was it like?
Yeah, we were very close. Both my grandmothers were like second mothers to me. My parents and I lived on the 5th floor of that building. My grandparents, the ones specifically that we're talking about today, were on the 4th floor, and my other grandparents were on the 3rd floor. So I could just take the stairs or the elevator and go over their house anytime. If my parents needed to go somewhere and they needed a babysitter, they had that in the building. So I stayed with my grandparents a lot and spent a lot of time with them. Even took trips with them as well.
Wow, so you were close with them throughout your life.
Very close, yeah.
And did you notice anything in their personalities that reflected like their experience having lived through the Holocaust? Were there any things about them that communicated to you that they had survived such a tragedy?
Most people who don't have Holocaust survivor relatives would think that they would be somber at all times because of what they dealt with and the tragedies they've seen and experienced. But my grandparents actually, I think they took a big lesson as far as celebrating life and trying to enjoy life to its fullest, despite what they had, what the cards they were handed. Understanding that they got through one of the most tragic times of history, of humanity, and now they're on the other side of that, and they have a family, and they have grandchildren, and they were able to really enjoy it. That's
great, and it shows their resilience through what had happened. That they were able to celebrate moments of joy and pass that down to their grandchildren. Is there like any specific memory that comes to your mind that kind of captures your grandparents? Are there any stories that you feel like really shows what they were like?
We used to go up to upstate New York and spend time there in the summer. And there was a lot of other people like them. Maybe some of them were Holocaust survivors as well. Everybody in that particular community that we went to were from the Soviet Union, former Soviet Union. So we had a lot of enjoyment there. And even though I was already a teenager and maybe didn't want to spend all my time with my grandparents, we sat at separate tables for dinner, but we were right near each other. But I would still walk over to them, enjoy their company. My grandfather actually did it. We did like our own walking tour of the community we stayed at. And that's something that stands out to me. And every moment of that walking tour is like a comedy. There's jokes, there's just his humor coming out and how he's describing the experience of being there.
That's great. So can we talk a little bit about your grandparents' journey in particular? Can you tell like the story of what happened to them?
Yeah. So my grandfather, Aaron, both my grandfather and my grandmother, Genya, they were born and grew up in Odessa, Ukraine. And in 1941, My grandfather was 12 years old. That's when not the war started necessarily, but the war started for the Soviet Union. That's when the Nazis invaded the Soviet Union, called Operation Barbarossa. So my grandfather was growing up with 2 brothers and a sister, and his parents, and they were very poor, but they weren't starving. They were poor, and they had a good relationship in the family. My grandmother, who lived practically maybe a block or 2 away from him, they didn't know each other as children necessarily, but she was a little younger than him, and she also had 2 brothers, and originally she had 2 sisters. Actually, she had 1 sister, and another sister was born right as the war was starting. She was just born. So she had a toddler sister and a baby, newborn, and she was 9 years old. So at some point, they were told that they needed to go register because they were Jewish. There were posters posted all over their city informing all Jews to report to specific areas and register. And anyone that would try to protect them or help them or hide them would be killed. This was written in the posters. In fact, something that many people don't know is that it was the Romanian army that were allied with the Nazis at the time, and they were the ones that invaded and occupied Odessa. The Nazis were there too, but the German Nazis, but the Romanian army were the ones that were really in charge in that area, and they were trying to win back land related to World War I, and that's why they allied with the Nazis. And they had their own faction of anti-Semitic authorities there too. So it was a bit more chaotic in terms of where they were taken, how they were taken, than some of the other stories that you may have heard of. They were taken to a jail, and then a week or 2 later, they were released. My grandfather came back to their apartment and their family, and half their things were taken. And then neighbors, non-Jewish neighbors, or one of them specifically, came by and started to accuse them of taking some of the things from her, and took even more things right in front of them, with the Romanian army standing by, allowing it to happen. So they were being robbed as they were being persecuted. Eventually, they were told again to report to the train station, and they were all taken by cattle car, packed into these cattle cars where you could barely fit, and they would stuff them where everybody had to stand for hours, or possibly even the whole day, taken to outskirts of Odessa, Ukraine. And from that point, it wasn't like they were taken straight to a camp. They had to march through the snow, and along the way, people were passing out or even dying because of being stuffed in a train with barely any air to breathe, walking through freezing cold through the snow. And anybody who would fall behind, either the Romanian army or if they were Nazis, they would basically rob them and shoot them because they took their belongings. Mm-hmm. I mean, most people took some belongings, either a bag or a small suitcase or something like that. So they still had something of value to the people at the time. So they would be robbed, killed, and left there to die in the snow. One memory that my grandfather brings up, and I have that in my book as well, is that there was a mother walking with her small toddler baby, and she was falling behind because the boy was sick or he wasn't feeling good, and she had to carry him. And basically, the Romanian army forced her to put her child down in the snow and continue walking. She had other children, so she had to make this choice, and it's an impossible choice to make. Mm-hmm. So she ended up having to leave her toddler son in the snow and continue walking through with the crowd. Yeah, and my grandfather saw this. And that's one of many tragic stories that both my grandparents witnessed. And
then from there, did they end up going to any of the camps, or what happened after?
So most people are familiar with Auschwitz, the mainstream known camps that were very organized by the Nazis. In their cases, they weren't taken to those camps. They were taken to smaller farm ghettos and camps in that area in Ukraine. And they were taken from one barn to another barn in the beginning stages, where they were just forced with a whole group of people to sleep there and then march again the next day. They're basically trying to weed out the weak amongst the group. People were dying along the way or being killed if they were falling behind, including my grandfather's aunt and others. And eventually they got to this area, or my grandfather and his family did, called Domanyovka. That's the area and the town, I guess. They named the camp that too. And they were Ukrainian collaborators that were working with the Romanian army and the Nazis running these camps. They were forced to work on farms and do all types of jobs. They would come on trucks in the morning, pick up whoever was available, take them to a job, bring them back. And they fed them barely anything, but they fed them just to give them some kind of fuel so that they could do the work. And eventually, there was a moment where my grandfather's family was tricked. Someone told them, someone came to them and said, we have some food. They had a little bit of movement. So it wasn't like Auschwitz where they would be locked up in a barrack and they would only be taken out. They had a little bit of ability to move around and leave where they were staying, go outside. They were terrified, of course, and it was cold and they barely had any belongings at that point. But they were taken by someone telling them that they were going to get some food or something. And they were basically robbed as they went there. They took all their belongings. They left them with nothing. Even my grandfather described it that they were actually left naked, pretty much naked, just rags. They didn't even have their main clothes on anymore. So at that point, they were all very skinny, sickly, starving. They didn't even have clothes. They couldn't work anymore. So they just locked them into this building and barely fed them, just waiting for them to die in there.
That's horrible. And did your grandpa ever talk about what it felt like to be like betrayed by like neighbors, by all these people on top of persecution by like the Romanians and the Nazis? Did he mention like what it felt like to experience such a lack of humanity by people that were living next to them or people that were working next to them?
Yeah. Well, it wasn't just my grandfather. Practically every Jew from the area experienced some kind of betrayal or the locals collaborating with the Nazis. And maybe some of them feared for their own lives. So you have to understand the time and the place and a war, and everybody was afraid, including the people who collaborated, because they could be killed too. But the level of cruelty that they inflicted showed that they had similar anti-Semitic views. And obviously it wasn't everyone. And there were some that actually helped and risked their lives, or hid people, or gave them a piece of food as they passed by, just to help them survive, or even just said, "Go in that direction; you're less likely to be killed." Something small like that. So there were a lot that helped, but there were enough that collaborated and inflicted cruelty that it left many of the Jewish people with resentment towards their neighbors and the country in general. And it's not like after the war, they were now somewhere else. They had to come back to these same neighborhoods and live with these same people.
Right. And what happened to your grandfather after the war?
So my grandfather lost both his parents to starvation during that time, that late stage time. His older brother was taken to work on a bridge for the Nazis and lined up afterwards, after the job was done, through a firing squad. And he barely made it out alive. He basically fell into a pit of other dead bodies and lied there pretending he was dead until the Nazis left, and then he finally climbed out with my grandmother's brother, and that's how our families connected. They were both in this group of young men working on a bridge. My grandfather made his way to a orphanage that was set up, not an official orphanage. It wasn't anything official, government known. It was just something that was popped up by a Romanian Jew that left Romania, ended up in Ukraine. A lot of Romanians were also being taken to this area. And these were all kids whose parents died during the Holocaust. So they just found a house or had a house available. People in Romania had a little bit more money. They were sending money to this person, this director of the orphanage, to help him take care of all these children. And that's how where my grandfather ended up. My grandmother ended up there too, because her father was killed, her grandmother was killed. Her mother was very sick and kind of was taken somewhere, but she didn't see her for a while. So she was all alone. So my grandfather ended up in this orphanage. And at some point, the Romanians switched sides. The anti-Semitic faction was somehow taken down. The army switched sides, and they were basically told to retreat. So they left the towns, and the Nazis came in and took over. And my grandfather stayed in this orphanage until like everybody started to scatter because the war was kind of coming to an end. They started to hear that the Soviet Union was fighting back the Nazi army and the German army back into their territory. So they started to hear that, but not all the cities were liberated yet. Mm-hmm. So they stayed in this town for a little bit. Some of the Soviet army and police came there and took testimony from him. At this point, he was probably 14, 15, something like that. And they actually captured a lot of these collaborators that were there and locked them up for temporarily until they would, I don't know what they would do with them, stand trial or something. But my grandfather stood guard at some point as a 15, 16-year-old, guarding these collaborators that the Soviet Union gave him a gun, and he basically stood there as a guard at the end. And eventually he made his way back to Odessa. But now he's an orphan. He's a teenager. Him and his siblings they came back to their apartment, and their neighbors said, "You're not welcome here. Your apartment's taken. None of your stuff is here. You should leave." Mm-hmm. So they were homeless at that point. Parallel to their story, my grandmother, who was 9 in the beginning of the war, at this point was probably 13, found her mother. She was also taken to the orphanage, but they were young and they didn't really meet, or they don't have memories of interacting at the mm-hmm. orphanage, my grandfather and grandmother. But their mothers knew each other, and their brothers knew each other from the neighborhood, and also from working on that Nazi bridge I told you about. So my grandmother and her siblings and their mom survived from their family, mm-hmm. and they found my grandfather and his siblings, and they invited them to come live with them temporarily. So it was basically my great-grandmother taking care of 7 or 8 teenage kids until they can get on their own feet. And that's where they ended up. They couldn't get either of their original apartments. Mm-hmm. They ended up going to some basement apartment in a building, and that's where they found another apartment eventually that had a blown out roof from the war, and they lived in that apartment.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's crazy. And do you feel that like your grandparents harbored resentment toward Ukraine during their lives?
I think so, yeah. And it's not just of what happened during the Holocaust or during the war. It's also after the war. They continued to experience continuous anti-Semitism. From systemic anti-Semitism from the government, meaning there were quotas at universities and certain jobs where you can only have a certain amount of Jews, mm-hmm. specifically towards Jews, and to leave room for everybody else to get those mm-hmm. jobs in those positions. But then also day to day, from neighbors, from people in their area, just saying random things to them, slurs or insulting them, or even someone trying to be nice. My grandfather has a story where someone told him, "Oh, you're not bad for a Jew." Even something like that, which this man was probably trying to be nice in a way, but that the way of saying that is not.
It's very
not
backhanded.
Taken.
Yeah. And when they eventually came to the U.S., I'll ask about that in a second. Did they only speak English, or would they continue to speak Ukrainian or Russian? Did you notice that there was a change in language usage at all?
My grandparents spoke primarily Russian. They also spoke Yiddish to each other, and they learned it from their parents. They continued to speak Russian. They learned English to become U.S. citizens and to work in America, but most of the time, they spoke Russian mm-hmm. to each other, within our family. It wasn't like many of the other Holocaust survivors that came earlier in history, like right after the war, mm-hmm. who came here, let's say from Poland. A lot of people came from Poland and wanted to abandon their old language and really became a lot more Americanized because they came at a younger age, so mm-hmm. it was a little easier for them.
Okay.
My grandparents were a little older, so it was harder for them to. But they learned. They worked in America, and they learned the language decently. Yeah.
There's a lot of stories where the survivors feel like they needed to abandon their
right.
own language. That's why I asked. I was wondering. But do you feel that they continued to speak in Russian because that was what they identified with, or do you just feel like it was easier for them because that was their mother tongue?
Yeah, I mean, we have a long description of what we are as a culture or as a people. Specifically at my family, we're Russian-speaking Jews from Ukraine. So Ukrainian became a major language more recently in history. Back then, everybody spoke Russian, more or less. Okay. People who spoke Ukrainian typically lived in more rural areas. All schools were in Russian. Everything official was in Russian. That changed when the Soviet Union broke apart, and gradually Ukraine and Russia started to become separate countries and separate cultures. And now, at this point, Ukraine really enforced Ukrainian in every official way. But we still absorbed much of the Ukrainian and Russian culture into our lives. And that's what we were. We're kind of like this combination of cultures. So we continue to appreciate that. You can appreciate a culture and a language without necessarily resenting it because of certain people that did cruel things.
That makes sense. And just one more question before we get to our next episode. How did your grandparents end up coming to the U.S.? Like, what did their life look like in between living with your great-grandmother and then, like, entering adulthood, I guess? What did that look like for them?
Right. So because they lived together, and my grandfather was the youngest of his siblings, and my grandmother became the youngest because she lost her two baby sisters. They were the last to leave the apartment with my great-grandmother. And my grandmother tells this story all the time. One of their friends or neighbors said to my great-grandmother, they should get married because it doesn't look good that they're living together in the same apartment. They were teenagers, but it just doesn't look good. He went to the army, he came back, and my great-grandmother told my grandmother, you should marry him. And it was almost like an arranged marriage, but they knew each other. So they weren't siblings, but they were living in the same household. Right. So they ended up getting married and moved out, eventually got an apartment, had my father and his sister, my aunt. And they continued to live in Odessa for a while. So let's say the war ended for, let's say, 45 when everything started to try to go back to normal, and they didn't leave until the late 70s.
Oh wow!
So it's another 30 plus years that they were still living there in this kind of tense environment. But my grandfather, he didn't have an education. He worked as a driver, taxi driver. He delivered bread from bakeries. My grandmother. I believe she was a nurse, but when she came to America, she got a job in a nursing home, taking care of other ill and elderly people. They did their best to enjoy life, and they didn't really have a Jewish education in the Soviet Union. It was forbidden. There was really not many outlets that they can go to experience that. But they knew some things from their parents, that their culture and about Judaism, and they continue to connect to that.
So we're going to end the first episode here, and we'll come back in our second episode and talk a little bit about the advocacy that Alex is involved with.